Go ahead and get started. So welcome everyone to our sixth event for this semester's Bellum Forum on Climate Change, Justice, and Health. I'm Rachel Washburn, Associate Professor in the Department of Sociology and also the Director of the Health and Society Program at LMU. Today, our event is titled Covering Climate Change, a Press Panel, and we're joined by Abrahm Lustgarten from ProPublica and the University of California at Berkeley, and Tara Pixley here at Loyola Marymount University. Our panel is going to be moderated by Evelyn McDonald, who's also in the journalism program here at LMU. I'll introduce Evelyn in just a moment, but before I do that, I just want to offer a few words of gratitude. I'm grateful for the planning committee, which is composed of Amy Woodson-Bolton, Evelyn McDonald, Mona Seymour, and Trevor Zink. They've all been really helpful in generating ideas for this year's series of talks and panels. I'm also grateful for the support of the BCLA Dean's Office and Ryan Allison Mullen and Abigail Davis. For folks joining, make sure you mute as you are joining us. That should have been a setting that was on there. Before I introduce Evelyn, I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. We want to acknowledge our presence on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Gabrielina Tongva people and their neighbors whose ancestors ruled the area that we now call Southern California for thousands of years. We pay our respects to the members and elders of these communities, past and present, who remain stewards, caretakers, and advocates of these lands. Indigenous peoples of Southern California have survived 3 conquering regimes and still thrive today in an unbroken chain linking past to present. As we think together this year and this semester about climate change, justice, and health, I hope we all gain a greater appreciation for the interlocking processes that continue to cause disruption, displacement, loss, and death in highly inequitable ways across species inhabiting the planet, both past and present. Let the resistance and resilience of the Gabrielina Tongva and their neighbors be in our hearts and minds as we sit with complexity and difficult feelings, hopefully moving towards action to reduce injustice, suffering, and loss. I'd now like to introduce today's moderator, Evelyn McDonald. She's a professor in the journalism program here at LMU and has written or edited 6 books, including Rock, She Wrote, Women Write About Rock, Pop, and Rap, Queens of Noise, the Real Story of the Runaways, and Women Who Rock, Bessie to Beyonce, Girl Groups to Riot Girl. She's also editor for the Music Matters series at the University of Texas Press, and she's been a pop culture writer at the Miami Herald and senior editor at the Village Voice. Thank you so much, Evelyn McDonald, for moderating this panel today. I'm going to go ahead and stop my share so everyone can see each other, and I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you for all you have done to put together this forum. It's been a really wonderful series of events that is continuing. I want to make sure people know about the Jenny Price event on Monday, which will be another fantastic writer and artist speaking to her own approach to climate change, including from her book, Stop Saving the Planet. So provocative title there. And thank you also, Trevor, for being our tech person and colleague. It's really great to see multiple departments and programs and schools collaborating in these discussions. And thank you to all of the students and other faculty and other maybe civilians who are out there in Zoom land. By the way, the Jenny Price event will be in person and online. So without further ado, I'm going to interview our first panelist, and she's going to make some opening remarks. And then I will interview our second panelist, Abrahm Lustgarten, and he will make some remarks. And then we will have a conversation between the 3 of us and also answer your questions. So please be prepared to ask questions, especially all of you journalism students out there. That is essential skill for you to have. So I'm very honored to introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Tara Pixley. Professor Pixley is a visual journalist, strategic storytelling consultant, and last but not least, an assistant professor of journalism at LMU. She has an MFA in photography, a PhD in communication, and 2 decades of experience as a media producer and editor for editorial, nonprofit, and commercial organizations. She was a Nieman Fellow at Harvard in 2016, and her photographic work and writing have appeared in, as well as she also does video work, by the way. She is our visual journalism expert. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Newsweek, ProPublica, Huffington Post, Nieman Reports, ESPN Magazine, many other places. She is also a creator and activist and organizer as well. She is a co-founder and board member of Authority Collective, an organization dedicated to decolonizing visual media and building community and opportunity for marginalized media makers. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and thank you, Rachel, and to all of the organizers of the Bellarmine Forum. And thank you, everyone who has joined us here today to talk about what I think is a very important subject. I wanted to start by bridging what I think is a really important, 2 very important things. As you've heard from my bio, again, thank you, Evelyn, I work in both journalism as a practitioner of visual journalism and as a writer and reporter, and also as a journalism educator and scholar of journalism studies. And one of the reasons why I find this, the important intersection of journalism practice and research is because it enables us to know how best to reach audiences, especially about very important big stories. And there's no bigger story in the history of humanity than the extinction level event that is the threat of climate change. So when I'm thinking about how to do impactful and accurate climate reporting, I found it useful to look at what social scientists have figured out about how audiences respond to particular types of information, especially for me as it relates to visuals, because unfortunately, so many people these days mostly look at images and don't spend as much time reading the very important long form work of reporters, like my esteemed colleague who was here with us today, Abrahm. So I wanted to go through some quick findings and examples to think about key elements of climate visuals, specifically from studies done by researchers of the Climate Visuals Project. I'm going to share my screen really quickly. Let me first. So hopefully you all can see that. Is it showing as a slideshow right now?
It's not. It's showing as
okay.
Notes and stuff. It wasn't
okay.
first though.
One second. Sorry about that. And actually, I want to give you all a link that I'm going to drop in the chat that I would love for you to take a look at. I think that you can sort of follow along with me as I talk about this. So I think I can just talk through it instead of showing you the simple graphic, but there are 7 key elements to impactful climate visuals that the Climate Visuals Project identified through researching, editing, surveying, and speaking with over 3,000 people across 3 different countries. And I wanted to talk through some of those today. So one of those is showing real people. And what is meant by real in that equation there is avoiding staged moments and focusing instead on the lived experiences that are unfolding in front of the camera. But I think the important takeaway there is to show people, to show how climate impacts are affecting human beings and animals, right? People all over the world, not just to show sort of landscapes and things like that. That can be incredibly powerful, but we really need to focus on the human impact. Also telling new stories. It might be tempting to go with the kinds of images that we know have already accrued wide-reaching symbolic meaning, like starving polar bears looting through trash cans at the edge of a town, or rivers and pools of poisonous-looking, brightly colored liquid runoff. Those are the kinds of images that have been impactful in the past, but people need to see new stories. They need to understand new things. And that it doesn't move the story forward. And it actually gives the impression of change having not occurred in the last 5, 10, 15 years. And imagining that the threat of climate change is similar to what it looked like 15 years ago. We know that that isn't true. And also showing causes at scale. So that means recognizing that many people don't have a clear idea of the causes and effects of climate change. So good climate reporting helps convey a sense of the worst climate offenders, such as the meat industry, and how greenwashing works without necessarily singling out individuals. And this, I think, is one of the trickiest things to do, is to show the scale of impact, but to make it understandable and comprehensible for audiences so that we're not just identifying individuals or particular communities or singling out particular industries, because we know that this is wide ranging and intersecting across a lot of different spaces. And then also show climate impacts more than anything. So studies have shown that people respond more to visuals that depict how people are impacted by climate change, and climate causes and solutions have less ability to move people, which doesn't mean that they don't move people. They should, and they do. But thinking about and recognizing, representing, and reporting on how people are impacted by climate change is what really connects people to thinking more broadly about this and engaging those stories. And then also the importance of understanding your audience. Are you speaking to a skeptical audience, a very informed audience? What sorts of assumptions or incorrect ideas can you acknowledge might exist and account for in your reporting to clarify and make the news comprehensible to all audiences? And then part of that, I think, or next step with that, is showing the local climate impact. The further away from your audience the environments in our reporting is, the less likely they are to connect with them. And that doesn't mean that we shouldn't show the global impact. Of course we should, but we also need to make this clear that this is happening in your house, in your neighborhood, right down the street, and it's happening half a world away. It's the entire world. And so how do we do that? We really focus on the local, and then we can link that out to national, global, et cetera. And then finally, I think this is a sort of interesting point. It's not as useful to focus on protest imagery or protest reporting. While there might be a lot of climate protests going on, news audiences tend to not connect with that, especially audiences that are on the political right. And so thinking about what kinds of images we're using across these 7 different ways of recognizing value, I think that is extremely important to bring to our climate reporting. I know as we talk across this hour, or I hope rather, we'll come across many different things that we're discussing that are impactful for connecting audiences to climate change reporting. And I just want to sort of, kind of underscore the importance of also of knowing what studies are being done, the research that is happening that is really trying to focus our attention on how we can reach the most audiences and make the most impact in terms of shifting people's thinking. And one more thing before I kick it over. I always want to draw attention to how important it is to not reproduce our implicit biases in any reporting, of course, all reporting, of course, but thinking about climate reporting specifically, it's our job to make the incomprehensible clear and to reach every person that we can. So if we are operating from any, sort of systemic racist colonial logics, if we overlook how climate impacts are unequally felt along gender, socioeconomic status, race, and other identity markers, then we're missing opportunities to tell the whole story of climate change. So I think maybe some of the students here today might have received the Covering Climate Equitably Solutions Project packet, and I really encourage everyone to take a look at that. And I'll put the link to that in the chat as well. And part of why I think that Solutions Network Guide to Covering Climate Equitably is really important, it's because it underscores all the ways that we can fail to acknowledge the inequitable impact of climate change. And if we're not showcasing that in our reporting, not only are we missing an opportunity to truly educate people about something important with our journalism, but we're also reproducing those kinds of inequities in our reporting as the people are experiencing with these environmental justice issues. So paying attention to that is really key. And that's my little spiel.
Thank you, Dr. Pixley. Can I just ask you a couple quick questions about it? So who conducted this research and how was it conducted? I think you mentioned 3,000 participants. I just want to get a little more sense of the project.
Yeah, so just to clarify, I did not participate in this particular research, but
Right.
it was surveys done with 3,000 people across, sorry, hold on. Yes, an international online survey of over 3,000 people with participants split equally between the UK, Germany, and the US. And they also had structured discussion groups with 32 people held in London and Berlin. So it was two different methodologies for having people react and respond to images specifically.
And so were animals not, that was not on the list of 7, was it? Did I miss? I'm
No, it wasn't. No, and I think that's, that's a great point. They kind of touch on that when they're talking about telling news stories, because interestingly, a lot of preliminary climate change reporting was done around, polar bears, the ice caps. It was talking about, this kind of inanimate, it was talking about animals and other inanimate spaces, like the seas are rising, the ice caps are melting, which is all true and important, but people have a very difficult time understanding how the ice caps melting is going to affect us here in LA. And it very much does. But if we're not doing that, if we're just showing pictures of melting ice and polar bears on them, we're not really conveying that clearly, right? So specifically to your point about animals, I think that is included in trying to convey the impact, but people still respond more strongly to images of humans than to animals. So I think that it's a nice, if we can get a good balance, then that is always ideal.
Thank you. Yeah, I thought that was really interesting because I think there is a tendency I think that's an arc that has happened in the narrative around climate, is moving from focusing on animals and biodiversity to focusing on the human impact. And to hear that that's actually what people want to hear is I think encouraging, because I think that that's that environmental justice intersectionality that we've talked about in other events, and that your reading also was the Covering Climate Equitably is all about. So very interesting. Yeah. I am wearing my polar bear dress nonetheless today in honor of, so that was my gesturing.
Polar bears appreciate you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm now going to introduce our second esteemed journalist who is joining us on our press panel here, where we're discussing how to cover climate change. Abrahm Lustgarten is an author and environmental reporter investigating climate change and our response to a rapidly changing environment for ProPublica and the New York Times. His recent investigations include a 3-part series on global climate migration, an examination of the global palm oil trade, the climate drivers behind pandemics, and how climate change is driving global water scarcity. His 2015 series examining the causes of water scarcity in the American West, called Killing the Colorado River, was a finalist for the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for National Reporting and received the top honor from the National Academies of Sciences. Lustgarten also co-produced the 2016 Discovery film, Killing the Colorado, based on that reporting. His earlier investigation into the environmental and economic consequences of fracking was some of the first coverage of this issue, and it received the George Polk Award for Environmental Reporting, the National Press Foundation Award for Best Energy Writing, a Sigma Delta Chi Award, and was honored as a finalist for the Goldsmith Prize. That's a slightly condensed version of the bio. There's a longer one online on the website for the Bellarmine Forum if you want to find out more about Abrahm Lustgarten. Abrahm, how would you like to get us started?
Thank you so much. That was a very nice introduction, and I'm thrilled to be here participating in the forum today. So thank you all for having me. I was going to start out by talking a little bit about some of the challenges of being a climate reporter. But Tara laid out the incredible complexity to communicating climate change visually too, which is just I think even an order of magnitude more difficult, and can bring out some of our worst sort of habits as media professionals. Maybe we circle back and talk about that. When I started covering climate change, to be honest, after years of being an environmental reporter, it was a struggle. What do you cover? How do you talk about the future in a journalistic framework? What makes an investigative story about climate change, which is really, what I do. I've been writing, about environmental and climate issues for a long time, and I'm passionate about, about these issues. But it's been one of the most profoundly difficult and challenging things to cover in my experience. And in part, I think that's because of the enormity of the issue. Because as we write about it, we're also living in it. It's an incredibly difficult thing. The world's changing faster than we can recognize. We're tasked with covering it as journalists, with recording history, with shaping how people think and what actions they take in response to it, all at the same time that we're figuring out how we think and how we feel about it as individuals, as people, as parents at the same time. And so the result of that is that in many ways, as journalists, I think we're kind of making it up as we go along, and we're experimenting at different moments in time with different techniques and testing for their effect and response and changing and adapting. But I think this is the story of our existence. It's probably the threat of our existence, and so we have an obligation to figure that out, figure out how to communicate about it effectively, to innovate and to adjust those styles of communication when they get outdated or become less effective. So the first thing I would say is that I think there is a great hunger for this information, for what we as journalists produce, and for the messages that we hope to convey. To throw out a couple quick statistics from the Yale program on climate change communication, which are probably a little outdated by now, but not too old, but they routinely survey Americans on their views of climate change and the media. The number of Americans who believe that climate change is already happening, is already affecting their lives, has jumped from about 59% to 73%. Yale researchers broke down Americans into six types across the spectrum, from alarmed and dismissive to, and found, with no great surprise, but it's the people in the middle, sort of the more moderate, who are cautious about their beliefs or moderately concerned, who express the most willingness to have their opinions changed. And so that's sort of I think, our target. We can avoid talking to the extremes on the left or the right, and kind of skip that conversation and find the most effective discourse right there in the middle. 74% of Americans say they're interested in reading news stories about whether climate change is happening. 77% are interested in reading about the causes. 79% are interested in learning about what government's doing in response to it. So as we struggle with how to cover this, we shouldn't fool ourselves or self-critique ourselves into thinking that the problem is that no one wants to receive this message, or that no one wants to talk about what's happening in our climate. I think the challenge is, how do you do it effectively? How do you capture people's imaginations and their motivations? So I want to tell you a little bit about how I've tried so far to find stories that resonate, in part by talking about this recent project that I did on human migration that wrapped up a little bit over a year ago. I try to look for the biggest themes, the broadest possible perspectives on the big ways that life on planet Earth is changing. And this gets to some of the human points that Tara was talking about. So often we talk about how the climate crisis is changing the physical world around us, the scientific facts, the increase in temperature, the number of degrees, the pounds of ice melting, and so on, but not necessarily about how it changes people's lives. So global data suggests that up to 3 billion people will soon find themselves living in regions that no longer offer optimum conditions for human life. That's the end result modeled out to 2070 of the effects of climate change on the planet. So in late 2019, I brainstormed a project aiming to explore how people will respond to that crisis. What does it mean to live through that change? Where will people go if their current environments are not the ones that support the quality of life that we seek out? So when will they move, and where will they go? And it did this using a combination of deep data reporting and modeling and on-the-ground reporting in some of the hotspots with the largest populations already unsettled by climate change. And that project had 3 stages. The first story was a big global look at large-scale population change. The second was kind of a micro dive into how this would affect the United States. And the third was a piece that looked at geographic opportunities that places, including Russia and China, might have, and what that means for kind of geopolitical security as the climate changes. For the world, for the global story, took this cutting edge research that associated certain conditions, like the hotter it gets, the more likely people are to move, or the more scarce water is, the more people are to move. And tried to build off of that a set of models, or build off of a set of models that the World Bank had developed to look at internal domestic migration related to climate change, and tried to build a model that would then look at international global migration across borders, and see how, if we could come up for an estimate for what the total scope of that displacement might be, and when it would happen. And then in very specific terms, my reporting focused on how many people adjacent to the United States would also begin to migrate, particularly out of Central America towards the US border, because that's a close example that affects us directly and immediately. And so this whole process was sort of an experiment. It was a kind of a journalist as scientist process where we didn't just report on research that others had done, but did the research and came up with new figures and new information that then we reported as news. We developed these models, enhanced them, and added to them to come up with numbers for how populations in Central America would respond to increasing drought and warming temperatures, mixed in with all sorts of socioeconomic factors ranging from the type of governance, quality of governance, to the level of international trade and migration that was allowed, and estimated that some 30 million Central Americans would be heading towards the US border within the next 2 decades, partially as a result of the influence of the changing climate on their lives. In Guatemala in particular, I was struck by the climate crisis already unfolding, where rampant malnutrition, decimated crops are tearing apart families, forcing hundreds of thousands to flee towards the US in 2019 when I was reporting, numbers that could soon grow to more than 1 million each year within a few decades, according to models. So the modeling in that case and our goal in the project was to give a sense of the scale and the direction of this global migration. It showed us that more emissions translate to more migrants, more people displaced. It also makes explicit the ways in which none of this is a foregone conclusion, that different government and policy responses to migration and to climate change make a dramatic difference in the outcome and the welfare of millions of people. Which means that we can support policy now and make changes in everything from energy use to migration and immigration policy that affect these outcomes. Open borders, foreign aid, urban planning and investment, climate policy, they all provoked significant differences in the models and how many people migrated and how many people were trapped at home. And ultimately it frames a choice that, even though the models look into the future, it sets the parameters for some accountability now, because it shows us what our governments and policymakers can do, and it gives them specific tools or guidance for how to act and respond to these changes. The second part of this migration project turned to the United States, and it was, once we had really refined what those influence factors were, the types of environmental conditions that force people to migrate, we could it's sort of straightforward to look at how those factors would emerge across the United States, and imagine how the U.S. population would also shift in response to wildfires, to increasing heat, to sea level rise along the coast, and so on. And I partnered with the Rhodium Group, which is a climate modeling and data firm, to model where those conditions would exist across the country and what the United States would look like. The problem is that the United States Americans don't necessarily respond kind of logically to climatic change the way people in the rest of the world do. We have a lot of perverse incentives like cheap insurance and other programs that encourage people to move to the coast of Florida, even though sea levels are rising, or to Phoenix, Arizona, even though the temperatures are off the charts. And so it's difficult to model that change in the United States the same way that we could model it for Guatemala. But that led to a whole other deeper conversation about what kind of perverse incentives still affect how Americans choose to move and where we choose to live, and opens up a whole other kind of avenue of accountability-oriented reporting. to be done. And that middle topic, the what happens in the United States, it's also the subject of a book that I'm working on now, which examines the geographic and demographic change that's coming through the United States in a much broader sense. And this is when you start to see the enormity of the environmental influence and how we expect that people respond to it in this country, where you can see mapped threats that will show not only places with great hardship and devastation in their futures, but places with great opportunity that might expect a real cultural transformation. Consider, for example, the kind of cultural transformation the US underwent during the Great Migration of Blacks out of the South. It's a movement on a much smaller scale than I expect will happen in response to climate, but that came to define so much of what American culture is today. And in particular, our arts, our sports, from Duke Ellington to Langston Hughes. And you imagine the kind of shuffling of American cities and urban areas and population change of up to 100 million Americans moving towards the end of the century in response to climate. And I think that we'll see a vastly different culture here and a vastly different society. And that's what my book is exploring. So these are the ways in which I try to frame, the big picture, considering the broadest cultural impact of how our lives will be transformed by a changing climate. Some of that's urgent disaster oriented, some of it's financially oriented, some of it's accountability or investigative, some of it's just explanatory. But mostly it's acknowledging that life is in flux and that the world we live in is changing, and it's going to change dramatically and swiftly, and we can start to have a conversation. Journalists can lead that conversation, or should lead that conversation, I think, about what that looks like, and that's really, I think, the puzzle that we all face professionally that we're trying to sort out. So thanks for indulging me on those initial thoughts. I look forward to answering questions and having a conversation about this.
Thank you, Abrahm. Really, really interesting, and I've been really enjoying reading your work over the years. And I have a couple questions for you, and then Tara also, if you have questions for Abrahm. We are all journalists, and I think can have a conversation between the three of us and to model asking you questions of each other. But Abrahm, one thing I wanted to ask you about, I guess actually it's for both sections of the migration. How do you know that people from I know historically people from Central America migrate towards North America, right, towards the United States. But were there any thoughts of that they might go south instead, or that if China and Russia, as you say, are actually going to be more the lands of opportunity, like how do you factor in, where people might go? Was that a consideration?
Yeah, very much so. So it just gets at the complexity of migration and of trying to model something like migration. So without trying to get too far down in the weeds, migration is a mixture of a whole number of factors, not all of which are related to climate change or ever will be, and not all of which could ever be quantified either. So there's the economic attraction to a new place, there's whatever's happening emotionally in your marriage, there's your financial situation, there's your climate and your ability to farm food, your ability to get employment, there's whether borders are open or closed, or whether there's conflict, or a safe and stable society in the place where you live, and on and on and on. So really, thousands of factors. And the models that we worked with basically try to historically tease out patterns in that behavior, and then try to tease out specifically how the environmental influences affect the other existing patterns, and then elucidate that and then project it further into the future. And as far as which direction people will go, and they'll go all directions. But to generalize, in Central America in particular, many people move north, and they'll move north in part because that's where the economic opportunity is, and in part because that's where the pattern of connections already exists. So there's been such enormous migration over generations out of Central America to the United States, that those family ties and those social connections then become the draw factors, that when somebody who newly considers themselves a migrant in Guatemala because they are running out of water and can't grow crops, is thinking about where to go. Are they more likely to go to Brazil, where they don't know anybody, or to the United States, where their third cousin, it works in construction in Houston or something like that? And so they tend to follow, migrants always tend to follow kind of those pre-existing patterns. And then the third thing is, this doesn't, not for the Americas so much as just globally, but the land mass of the planet trends north. The economic activity of the planet trends north. The cooler climates are in the north. There's there's just less places to go in the south, and so generally mass migration tends to move northward, but not exclusively. So.
And then I also want to ask you, the third part of your series, as you said, focuses specifically on the global impact of climate change, and actually specifically on Russia, which of course seems extremely timely now. Do you have any thoughts based on that research about what's happening? Do you think that has anything to do with what Putin is doing now in terms of seeing a stronger economic future, maybe because of climate, and wanting to grab all he can? Or this is a realm of speculation. I'm not a Russia expert by any means. I would not think that he is aggressively taking these actions in Ukraine because of climate change, but I do think that he sees this as a fleeting moment in history where he has unprecedented leverage, and one of those is climate related, which is he has incredible power in the global food markets. Russia has used its opening amounts of land and thawing land, to become the largest global exporter of wheat and grains. And a lot of the developing world and the global south depends on Russia for their food supply, and that's an incredible geopolitical piece of leverage. And the second is that all of his wealth comes from oil and gas. And from a climate perspective, if you understand that that's going to be phased out, then this is probably his apex of financial security to do whatever he wants to do. Thank you. I think that's very insightful, and I think we don't necessarily think of the relationship between climate and war, or I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to call it war, but
it is war.
I know. So let me ask both of you. I think one thing, and I teach a course on nature writing, and we're really covering how to write about the climate in ways that are effective. And you both raised those questions about how can we effectively communicate something that people are more willing to hear now, as you reported, Abrahm, but that is sometimes hard for people to hear, and that obviously there's also a portion of the population that just refuses to acknowledge it or believe it. So we had Cara Buckley from the New York Times speak to us earlier in the semester, and she talked about how she was trying to avoid the sort of doom scrolling, right, of just reporting bad things, and we also had another researcher speaking about climate anxiety and how too much negative reporting causes people to shut down. So, but nonetheless, these are scary things that we're reporting. So how do you, both of you, think? How do you, in your own reporting, and Tara, I know you're doing work around fossil fuels and LA, how to report that there are bad things happening without just paralyzing people with anxiety?
Yeah. I think I'm a huge proponent of solutions journalism and that approach to reporting, because it makes the problem clear and evident. It's backed up with the same kind of factual and factual information and focused on accuracy, but it takes it a step further by identifying what is being done, who is, what are communities doing. It's not just some emphasis on, some Elon Musk tech individual who is promising everyone the world or an off-planet option. It's about, what are you doing in your community right now? What are the people who are the most impacted doing to affect change? And that, I think, does two things. One, it moves us away from the doom scrolling. It gets us to think that solutions are possible. And two, it's inspiring. It helps to bring attention to what is being done, what is possible. It gives people ideas for what can be done in their own community and how to see themselves as not just watching, this terrifying thing happen, but imagining themselves as it being possible for them to be part of the solution. So I think that solutions journalism, the solutions focus is really important, especially with climate reporting, to kind of call in the news audiences and acknowledge, we're all in this together, and what are we thinking about? What are we missing? What else can be done? That's kind of my take on it, is that solutions journalism approach for sure.
Abrahm, I think you include solutions as part of what you report on. How do you start?
I think if you want to see change, then it's helpful to map out the change that you suggest that people make. So I guess that's a form of solutions journalism. Or if you're seeking accountability through your reporting, lay out who should be held accountable and how. And I guess that's sort of my approach. I think we're moving out of an era of the shock factor of trying to grab people by the lapels and wake them up to climate change, right? Like the David Wallace Wells Uninhabitable Earth. We don't want a nihilistic response to what's happening, because that's not going to help us get out of this situation. So I think that I agree generally. Doom scrolling is bad. It's scary. It doesn't serve a really productive purpose anymore. And that people need solutions. But I also am really, loath to sugarcoat what's happening. And I think that it's the scope of change is so enormous. Its impacts, no matter what we do next, will still be so dramatic. And the scale of action in response to it is so huge that it's not easily addressed through solutions journalism, in the sense that a lot of people, I think, are talking about it right now. And it's really important to empower people about what they can do and how they can live their lives to play a part in having a greener, cleaner world that can slow down the rate of climate change. And we do still need to slow down the rate of climate change. So we have to do something. But there is this sense, I feel like, in some of the solutions journalism that's if you pay attention, we've known what we need to do for a long time, and people have been saying what we need to do for a long time. And that's really a wholesale re-engineering of our economy and our habits of consumption and the lifestyles that we expect and whatever. And that's been crystal clear. And what I hear from editors, for example, in the solutions journalism community, is no, really, but what should we do? What can we do? I know that's all important, but what can we do? Should I recycle more or something small? And what it becomes is, a little bit of an excuse, I think, to give yourself a pass in maintaining the same lifestyle that's gotten us collectively into this mess, while doing a little bit of good that, chips away in a small way that won't save the planet at making it better.
Yeah, and I want to kind of tack onto that. Completely agree. The thing about a solutions journalism approach is that typically it's focusing on the sort of small scale solutions. Planting a community garden is not going to refill the Colorado River. It is not going to, bring back the ice cap. So for me, that's about scalability. What can you do right now today to impact something a little bit? Here are some things. What else do we need to do collectively? We need to radically shift, as you're saying, our relationship to our food industry, how to transportation, also drawing attention to I read so many stories about how nothing is being done, but there's less I wouldn't say none, this is definitely happening, but there's far less attention paid to why, who benefits from not doing anything. Why are these things continuing to happen? It's not just, the government is useless. There are major players who are making money off of climate change. They're making money off of all of the different things that are contributing to climate change. And so it behooves them to keep the status quo. We need to bring more attention to that, because part of the solution is bringing all of that to the attention of the public and directing them to say, this is a really big issue. And we're informing you so that you can activate to address that and impact change there.
Yeah, I agree.
Right. And I think one of the ways in which that happens, and it's something I know you've written about, Abrahm, is showing that the financial impact of climate change is actually going to be overall catastrophic, or at least is going to be powerful, and that short-term profit motive that's driving some players definitely in the economy and in politics is going to backfire, say in Florida, where all those the insurance industry is going to collapse. And actually, I have to say, it was funny. I was reading your story, and actually I did move from Miami, and it was definitely in my mind that the property that I owned was below sea level, and actually the insurance rates had gone through the roof because of hurricanes. But so yeah, how much is that a strategy in your reporting to show the people who are we live in a capitalist economy, who are trying to make money, that it's in their best interest to change, to divest from fossil fuels and develop clean energy?
Yeah, it's very much a part of, my strategy, if you call it that. I hate that we live in an environment where conversations like this need to be framed around what they cost and who can benefit financially from them. But since that's the way we have most of these conversations, I think it's an effective way to talk about climate change locally and globally. And then it just so happens that I really think, especially now as renewable energies scale up, for example, and and the consequences become greater and more expensive to inaction as well, that it actually pencils out. So it's not that difficult of an argument to make. It's just a difficult argument to win, because it really comes down to who's paying. And you look at like the tanked Fed nomination this week, and the forces behind Raskin not being appointed, not receiving Senate approval, and it's because the oil and gas industry is trying to preserve or eke out a couple more decades of mediocre profits before they're completely shut down, and that influence and that lobbying was able to have enough effect to steer the direction of that the U.S. central bank will take and how it views climate risks. So that's disconcerting. But it's one special interest.
I think you should probably, our students aren't aware of what you're talking about. If you want to just explain a little more what happened.
Yeah, sure. Do I have her name right? Correct me if I'm wrong. Is it Donna Raskin? So Biden's nomination to the Federal Reserve, forget which position, but a high-level position in the Federal Reserve, had expressed the non-controversial sentiment that the Federal Reserve needs to look harder at how the U.S. banking industry and the U.S. economy has vulnerabilities related to climate change, how climate change will lead to large numbers of stranded assets and stranded loans, similar to what happened in the 2008 financial crisis, that could ultimately tank the U.S. economy. And so the oil and gas industry in particular, and the coal industry along with them, and Joe Manchin along with them, saw that as the threat that it is to their business model, because the banks are heavily invested in the hydrocarbon industries that have yet to use all of that investment to produce more oil. And if they stop producing oil, then less lending into those industries will grind it to a halt, and they'll all lose a whole lot of money.
Thank you. Tara, I know you've been doing some reporting around the fossil fuels industry in Los Angeles, and that you co-taught a course in which the students also participated in this reporting. Do you want to talk about what you've found here and what you were doing in your work?
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ongoing project, and I would be remiss if I didn't cite my co-teacher, Jason Jarvis, or co-professor, because it was his research on greenwashing that really clued me into what was happening here in Los Angeles. And then I began working with Earth Justice on a long form story to look at the environmental justice impacts of LA's oil infrastructure. And one of the things that I noticed is there's so many intersections of race and gender and socioeconomic status, level of education, access to sort of political validity, right? That a lot of the communities where oil infrastructure is being cited is they tend to have working class, primarily the population is primarily working class. There are undocumented immigrants. There are people who either don't have the time, they're working multiple shifts, multiple jobs, taking care of a lot of different family members, extended family. So they don't have the time to kind of, show up and picket and make phone calls to Senate and do all of that kind of political activation that requires so much time. They don't necessarily have the sense that they have the right to do those things because they feel vulnerable for their citizenship status. So there's all of these ways in which people are being disenfranchised, and the oil infrastructure, the oil companies are citing their drilling, their refining, even their transportation facilities and routes. They're intentionally citing it in these neighborhoods because they know that these are the people the least likely to push back, but they have the most to lose. And that became very apparent spending time in the rural, like, farmland of Kern County, speaking to people there who are experiencing, the air quality was abysmal. The water is undrinkable. There are oil wells situated right in the fields of carrots and grapes. And there's also a lot of denial, just, rampant denial. This either people don't know that these things are happening, like in Los Angeles, where a vast majority of people I've spoken to, even those living down the street from oil wells, they might realize that they're in proximity to oil infrastructure, but they don't know anything about the negative health and environmental impacts of oil infrastructure, or they have no clue that we're living on 28 oil fields and we're one of the biggest, the Los Angeles County is one of the biggest drillers of oil in the world. That kind of information is well hidden, and the oil companies are doing things like hiding oil wells in behind pretend building facades, making it look like office buildings around the oil well. They're hiding methane vents as street lights. So there's clearly a lot of work being done to produce that denial, to continue and extend that lack of knowledge. And when people don't know about something, they can't do anything about it. And so I see a lot of connections between that particular environmental justice issue and how that is aligned with climate change and people's relationship to climate change.
Thank you. I want to open it up to questions from the audience. So if I see questions, you can post them in the chat, or you can also raise your hand and I will call on you to speak. I'll take a question from John Cedar. And I'm not sure if this is directed at, I guess I'm going to assume it's directed at both of you. As journalists, how do you deal with the fact that some people argue that climate change does not exist?
I mean, I can simply say I don't anymore. I think that we've for good reason, moved beyond that conversation. The scientific consensus is clear, and the people who still don't believe that it exists are a very small minority, and it's not a productive place to put our efforts.
I would say from an institutional standpoint, if you're working within a news organization, you can't engage in that kind of thinking anymore. But I do think that recognizing who your audience is, right? The different levels of knowledge that people might be bringing about climate change, and making this both the scientific information that proves this is a fact, and also the information that helps people understand the human and environmental impact, trying to make that accessible, right? Making sure that you're always doing the work of meeting people where they are, and not assuming, well, everyone agrees that this is what, not just that this is a fact, but what is even happening, right? We've actually only recently come to a point where the AP style book is saying this is, we call it climate change. It is this thing. We're moving away from global warming and all of these other ways of speaking about climate change that was frankly very confusing and not incredibly useful. So that's my response to that on an institutional level. I would say that on an individual level, if you're trying to convey the importance of this to people who are saying, well, I don't believe this, always start with asking a question. Why don't you think it's true, right? Because then you can get at, what is it that, is someone just saying this to get a rise out of you? Or do they have actually incorrect information that you can help walk them away from? It's not useful to say that's stupid, or, you're an idiot, that you're wrong. Those things might feel true in the moment, but they're not going to be useful in terms of getting someone to actually understand facts.
Thank you both. And thank you for students that are putting questions in the chat. I'm just going to read them in order, pretty much. So Andrea Per Madrigal asks, what actions do you wish to see students who are here in this room, Zoom room, take after this event? For either one of you. And maybe go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. I just spoke, so I feel like I shouldn't speak again, but I'll quickly respond to that. I would really like for everyone to educate themselves. That is the most important thing that we can do, is to be very knowledgeable about what is happening and to seek to educate others whenever we have the opportunity. If someone does say something that is factually incorrect, point them to what you have seen. Try and engage them in conversation about, to move them closer towards this knowledge. We all have to be sort of armed with information so that we can affect change in climate change, whatever way we have.
And I should also mention that Abrahm also teaches at Berkeley. So you also are dealing with students on a regular basis. So what do you tell them to do, or what should these students do?
Yeah, I mean, I'll second, what Tara just said. Then this brings out the activist in me, but I mean, students should do the same thing that we all should do, which is, vote and support dramatic change in the various policies that will lead to lowering emissions right away. And vote locally for investment in the measures and spending and adaptation that will make the impacts that are coming a little bit less painful and a little bit less divisive. And can thirdly consider going into some sort of leadership, running for office.
Awesome, thank you. Alex Kalta asks, how or what got you so focused on the issue of climate change?
It was sort of foisted on me. I mean, I was an environmental reporter for a long time, but not thinking about my job as climate change. And then ProPublica got a grant, to fund more intensive reporting on climate change. And it, I was steered in that direction, and so it became my beat. I mean, I already cared, but I wasn't that well educated on it. And then I became, more familiar with climate issues, and it all just goes from there. I mean, if you read the science, if you compare it to dig into it every day, which is a whole other, issue, it's pretty hard not to, then see it as kind of the existential threat that it is.
Yeah, I feel very strongly that what we are facing is an extinction level event, and anything less than that acknowledgement is too little. And the work that I do, both as a journalist and a journalism educator, a scholar of journalism, for me, it's all about trying to identify how we can understand one another better to move toward a better future. So in order to have that future, we need to save the planet, right? And part of saving the planet is saving each other, is recognizing the systemic social inequality that has brought us to this point. Rampant colonialism, rampant neoliberal capitalism, those things have structured our world such that this, sort of climate change apocalypse is possible. And the only way that we can walk back from that, or we won't escape unscathed, but the only way we can get to a point where we continue to live as global humanity is to recognize how those inequities continue to play out through climate change. If we think about labor, about the value of all human beings and migration, borders, all of these things, who has the rights to water, who has the rights to air, all of this stuff that's trying to be quantified and commodified that should be human rights, that's participating in, and climate change is predicated on that way of thinking about the world and people and land and politics. So for me, climate change is not only the most important thing that we will face as a species, but it is the way through which we can understand everything else that is happening: war and migration, systemic racism, environmental injustice. It's all tied up there. So it is the story for me.
Thank you. I think this is a good follow-up question from Claire Pashut. Do you believe that reporting on people's experienced impact from climate change versus the landscape or the animals is working to push against the narrative that climate change isn't real?
Yes. Yeah, no, so the second story in that migration series is a good example for me of that, because so the story was about, how the pressures of events, disasters that are climate related are changing how comfortable Americans are where they live, and how easily they can afford to live where they live, and where they might go in response to that. But it wasn't a story that said climate change is coming for you in the United States. It was more a story that said, if you're experiencing all of these different things and they're very unsettling, one, you're recognized and feeling unsettled, and two, they're because of your changing climate. And I got a really sort of extraordinary level of feedback to that story from people across the political spectrum that was really different from the kind of feedback I normally get, that was much more conservative across the board, was much more diverse in a lot of ways, politically diverse, especially geographically diverse. And it was, a lot of it was along the lines of thanks for opening my eyes to what's happening in my community. I didn't quite know. I live in rural California in the foothills of the Sierra, and my family's been ranchers for 6 generations, and I don't know how to describe the fear that I feel about, can I continue this ranch, or what's happening to my community, but we can't make our farm work. Thanks for helping me see what's happening, period. So it really was not, a politicized conversation. And I think that connecting their human experience with that change is what makes that possible.
I would also completely agree that focusing on the lived experience, what is happening to me today that is because of climate change, that is something that really shifts people's perspective. And also being able to tie it to so many different things. My family mostly lives in Jamaica and Miami. Jamaica and Miami will both be entirely unlivable within this century. And it's all, even though that hasn't yet happened, what is currently happening is climate gentrification, where the people who have more money move away from the coasts and the people who have less money get pushed out of where they currently live inland, where they were previously pushed because it was too expensive to live on the coast. So now there's this shifting of who can live where. And as the coastal areas remain still too expensive and now dangerous for people to live, where do all of the working class people go? Where do the people of color who have been, inequitably impacted with their socioeconomic status at the intersection of race and who makes money and how much they can make? Now they're seeing the impact of where they can live based off of climate and what's happening, not just with sea level rise, but flooding and increased hurricanes. So all of these different things are happening. And yet there's so few stories about climate gentrification. We're not turning our attention to that. The millions of people who are experiencing that, it's also happening here in Los Angeles. But that's not something that people are talking about. We need to bring more attention to who is being pushed out of their home today to make way for a wealthier person who's trying to move out of the path of climate change. And why isn't that wealthier person, using their wealth and privilege to stave off that future for everyone instead of just pushing out and disenfranchising others? So those are issues that are happening right now that we can draw attention to, and putting it into that kind of frame and framing for people, I think, is incredibly useful for them to understand what's happening and to see that around them.
Thank you. The next question is from Caden Sullivan, and I might want him to give us an example, but I'll just read it first. How do you approach reporting the solutions in a piece where the available solutions are at odds with one another? Or I would also say that the solutions may be at odds with how people want to live or what they want to hear. And Caden, if you want to give an example of solutions that might be at odds with one another, feel free to speak up or drop it in the chat. But do either of you have a response to that as is? Are there?
An example would be really useful.
Yeah, okay, here's his example. Like, oh, okay, or I see. If two scientists have say different things about an issue, or if there's conflict between your sources over what to do. Does that ever happen?
I mean, that example, that happens all the time. But it's our responsibility to interview more than two scientists. So, I'll look for, in that situation, the consensus, of the research, or try to get a sense of, if, and maybe there's disagreement over a totally valid, subtler point. But in my experience, most of the disagreement, is most of the real disagreement is in a very narrow range of broadly agreeing on the same things. And so you can either step back and generalize that point in your reporting, or you can dive deep and try to figure out, what the consensus is of that viewpoint. But I don't think that we're talking about, if the example is meant to be like climate change is real, climate change is not real. I think we have a responsibility not to give too much voice to those non-consensus views if we dig deep enough to make sure that we believe that they're inaccurate. I'm trying to be careful because I don't think we should only report on consensus either. But with climate science in particular, it's a little bit of a different beast. I mean, there's a very, very small number of scientists that use purportedly scientific processes and jargon to prove a point that doesn't appear that I've yet to see really have factual merit. So. Begin to answer.
Right. So Daniel Sullivan asks, what news agencies do you think provide the best coverage on climate change events? And I would also say, I would add to that, maybe are there particular journalists that you recommend, as well as outlets? Besides, of course, the two of you.
I was going to say, I really recommend the work that ProPublica and the New York Times is doing. And actually, I think the LA Times, well, with your wonderful series, Abrahm, and I think the LA Times has been doing a good job recently thinking about environmental justice issues specifically. So looking at how these microforests are being installed and to impact climate change in that kind of sort of solutions focus, but then also looking at how the lack of green cover in Los Angeles has had an equal impact or an equitable impact across, working class versus wealthier neighborhoods, and what that looks like in terms of climate change, and how the people who were affected by redlining and systemic racism 30, 50 years ago now are going to be more impacted by climate change because of those racist choices. So LA Times is doing a good job looking at that. I personally don't feel like I have seen an organization that consistently is looking at this. So maybe you'll have a better example of that, but I think The Guardian has done some really excellent pieces. It's more like these incredible projects that I see happen that really put things into context for around specific issues.
Yeah, I mostly agree. For mainstream news, The Guardian does really great, consistently great sort of forward-looking stories. Not the largest volume of them, but the smartest. The Washington Post and the New York Times definitely, and the LA Times as well. Favorite reporters are, Rosanna Shah at the LA Times and Sammy Roth, both. And then Chris Flavelle at, I'm partial because we used to work together, but at the New York Times is just really smartly looking at the economic, implications of climate change, which is a pet interest of mine. It's worth looking a level deeper at like a site like Inside Climate News, which is a little bit niche, but does really good reporting. And a little bit wonkier, but if you want to dive deeper into those issues, and then E&E News, Environment, and I don't know what the second E is, but it's a it's a little newsletter out of Washington D.C. is also super smart and gets down in the weeds of policy and hearings in Washington and stuff like that.
Thank you.
And energy and environment.
Energy and environment. Thank you. I just thought of it.
Fact checker Tara Pixley. And actually, I did invite Rosanna Shah to be on this panel, as a matter of fact, and she respectfully declined. She did speak to my class last year, though. She's fantastic.
She's great.
Yeah, she is. Anthony Gunter had a couple questions. I chose this one. What can we do directly and effectively as regular people to combat corporate corruption and pollution in the climate sphere, such as millions in lobbying, skirting of environmental law, and using poor haven countries with less regulations to produce and dump product waste? So how do we call corporate players into account?
Campaign finance reform.
Well, since we're speaking to a lot of journalism students, in addition to, informing yourself, continue in the field of journalism. Try and get into spaces where you can report on climate change and the attendant issues that you connect with, that resonate with you. Do the work of educating the populace. That's what we have to do. And, I don't personally have the ability to change a campaign, to reform campaign finance. If someone feels called to run for office and be a champion of the environment, do that. And, find others that you can collectively work together to push, to push for climate, things like campaign finance reform and climate change policies, or informed by climate change. And I would really say, I hate this whole, there is this sense of, well, we need to recycle because recycling is this individual thing that you can do. And without getting into the mire of recycling, recognizing what individual personal behaviors you can shift that will be useful, and also recognizing what behaviors we have that in all these small and big ways prop up climate offenders. So are you banking with someone who is invested in fossil fuels, is invested in, keeping the meat packing industry the way that it is? Look at all of the different components of your life. How can you divest from the things that are negatively impacting the environment? How can you begin telling other people, your family, your friends, encouraging folks around you to attend to our, not just our personal practices, but how do we step away from being imbricated, being connected to and pulled into the sort of corporate miasma of climate offense? So again, I want to caution people from getting too much into it's, your personal practices, but really identifying how it's the responsibility of major corporations to change, and how do you actually just stop engaging with those major corporations as much as you can, because we don't want to be giving them the money to continue to destroy the environment.
Or to have the universities that we pay tuition to or that we are part of support those industries. Not to name any names, but Nara Miriam, this might be our last question, asks, as journalism students, we've been taught to consume our news with some skepticism. How do you suggest we navigate through climate news and when to fully trust it? And I guess that part of that would also be, we talked about who are the good players in climate news. Is there climate misinformation out there, and how do we recognize it and avoid it?
Well, that I would say, that's just a matter of media literacy, right? If I'm reading an article and something sounds off to me, or it goes against information I've seen elsewhere, then I follow it to its source. Okay, who did they quote? This person who is the director of environmental policy at a New America for the Environment. Then I go and look at, what is New America for the Environment? Who funds it? Oh, Coal Plants of America. Well, that sounds to me like maybe there is something off, right? So you have to be responsible for the information that you consume. And I wouldn't say that you should bring a level of skepticism to journalism, but you should bring a very informed and expansive approach to consuming your news media. And always ask the question, who benefits from this, right? The New York Times doesn't actually make money off of you knowing about climate change, but some person that they are, one of the reporters is interviewing might, right? They might in some way be connected to value for them. So just looking at these things, not with this sort of like, I'm probably being lied to mentality. I don't think that's useful, but looking at this to say, I always want to know more. I always want to know where this information is coming from. Whose ideas am I consuming and ingesting as fact, right? So not necessarily skepticism, but very expansive, informed position, right? Always looking to know more.
Do you want to add anything?
All that? No, I
Okay.
think that nails it.
All right, let me squeeze in one last question from the journalism director. Kate Pickard asks, what stories aren't getting enough coverage that journalism students can try tackling? Abrahm, I'm going to ask you that one since Tara took the last one.
Thanks, Kate. I don't know. It's a hard question. I mean, all stories. I think it's come up in a couple conversations recently, but I feel like we're moving from a stage of warning or sounding alarm bells to one of kind of bearing witness in general. And so there's a need for stories that do that that just help people see what's happening around them, or put a label on what's happening around them. And so, I think that thinking about every story of all kinds in its climate context is one important contribution that's not happening enough. And that might mean you don't take an economic story and make it climate focused, but that you take an economic story and you consider how it's affected by climate and how it affects, the climate issue, and maybe add in that context or take a second look in that way. And the second goes back to what I was saying about my U.S. migration story, but just to help people see that their lives are being changed in some way by this. When there's 500 heat-related deaths in a single season in the city of Phoenix was sort of an obvious example. But that's a climate-driven mortality event, and I'm not sure that that's like the secret story that no one knows about that students should take on. But I think generally speaking, just looking for those avenues to highlight climate's impact, there's lots of room there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that. I think speak to people who are where you are, right? So as a student journalist, what is impactful for you? What resonates with you about climate change reporting? What climate stories do you read or come to know information about that have really affected you and your relationship to climate change? Focus on that. Make it comprehensible and comprehensive for your audience. And if your audience is LMU students or college students, whoever you're speaking to, then really try and make this make sense in a way that is impactful for you if you were reading that.
I'll just add also, because I just thought of this as Tara was speaking, but she has mentioned this a number of times today, but looking at equity issues across the board, I think is a real opportunity for stories. And we didn't talk enough about it, but I think the fundamental manifestation of climate change socially will be a broad widening of all sorts of inequality across the board between every type of person, and so you can find that everywhere you look, whether it's in the rising cost of energy for cooling costs, or the climate gentrification that Tara was talking about, or health inequities, or rising levels of pandemics in parts of the world and so forth. A lot of those are inequalities that will be exacerbated by climate change, and there's a universe of stories to look for there at the local level and at the bigger level.
Great. And I would also say, really think about what is happening now. So much of climate reporting focuses on in 50 years, in 80 years, by the end of the century. Those things are all incredibly important for us to know, but they're not super useful in terms of getting me to act today. So if you want to inspire people to realize that action has to be taken right now, talk about what is happening right now. Who is dying right now? Who is having to leave their unlivable farm right now? Who is losing access to water right now? That the answer to that question is thousands, millions, right? So tell those stories.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. Thank you everyone for your excellent questions and for being here. And thank you, Rachel. I don't know if you want to come back on and say anything, but thank you, Rachel, for putting this together.
Great. Yeah, I'll just say very quickly, because I know we're over time. Thank you, everybody, our presenters, Abrahm Lustgarten, Pixley, and Evelyn McDonald for doing a wonderful job moderating the panel. Just a plug again for our next event happening next Monday, on Monday the 21st at 2:30. It's going to be in person, also with a Zoom component. Jenny Price will be presenting on Stop Saving the Planet, or how to finally do something about climate change. So we'll be talking a lot more about solutions, but this has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Rachel.
Thanks,
Take care.
everybody.
All right, thanks so much, Evelyn. That was great. I had another question for the.
I'm sorry.
Oh, don't worry at all. I had my students read, I don't know if you know Candace Callison. She wrote a book on how climate change comes to matter. It's 2014, so it's a little bit old. But she has a whole chapter focused on journalism covering climate change and some of the challenges for journalists. So I think they answered my question, but one of the things she talks a lot about is just the difficulties of covering this really complicated science. But I feel like both Abrahm and Tara really touched on sort of now, really emphasizing impacts on people, which perhaps is a little bit of I don't want to say easier story, but it's, in the past, we went back and I downloaded New York Times pieces from the 1980s and printed them out so students could read what were people saying in the 1980s and the 1990s, kind of looked over periods of time, to just kind of think a little more critically again about journalistic coverage of climate change. And yeah, it was interesting. And in the past, it really was about what's going to happen in the future, and I think both of our speakers today really reflected that, and I really liked how Tara closed it, what's happening now, right? It's not just about the future. So that was really great. Thanks so much, Evelyn. You did a wonderful job. I'm really grateful for your help.
Thank you. Thank you for letting us have that. So, and I saw that Robin Crabtree was on.
Yeah, she was. Yeah, she said a little note that she was really happy with the coverage. So, or the panel.
Right. Good. Great. Well, I'm
All
looking,
right.
looking forward to Monday.
Me too. So I'll check your email about joining for lunch ahead of time and stuff.
Yeah, hopefully I can. It just depends on, I have 2 classes. I have a class that morning too, so we'll see.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
All right.
Take care. I see that some people are still on. Sarah, I don't know if you had a follow-up question, or Hatham, or if folks just kind of left their computer. Sarah, did you have a question? No. Okay. All right.